Okay, let's start by congratulating you on the book.
Oh, thanks, John. Yeah, look, it was one of those things that I just felt I had to do, and to be quite honest, it wasn't a great task to do it. I mean, a lot of people labour over books, but I had a lot of fun writing it, and it all sort of flowed out pretty quickly.
Do you think there's probably been a bit of a lack of this in the past, a documentation of our own rock history here in Australia?
Well, not only a lack, but zilch, to be quite honest. I mean, they're really, by somebody who's a participant, there's been none. I mean, journalists have written about the period, but as far as an actual artist from that time writing about it, I'm the actual very first. Billy Thorpe, obviously he's had a couple of books out, but they actually weren't about this period at all. But his first book was in 1964, was set in 1964, and his second book was about the sort of like the 70s Sunbury period, and into when he was in America. So they didn't deal with it at all. So I'm actually the very first that's written about this sort of golden age of rock and roll, I guess you'd say.
Overall, how did you find the experience of going back over such a major part of your life like that? Did it really test the memory a bit?
No, not really, no. In fact, I did very little research at all, just a few dates and places here and there, but basically it was all from memory. I have to say I've got a pretty good memory for events and things, and a little bit of a guide from Go Set magazine here and there, just to get things in the proper chronological order. But I'd lived with those stories for, I've told them around kitchen tables and lounge rooms for the last 30 years. So, they're sort of firmly, indelibly stamped in my mind. So it was just a matter of sort of relating those stories onto paper.
Sure. Let's go back over some of that history. Tell us about the early days as the Mustangs. Was the material you were doing there pretty much different to the direction you later took?
Oh yeah, absolutely. We were a blues band. We started off as a blues band basically, and we'd dig out old blues records and do our versions of those old songs. People like, I guess, Lead Belly and Robert Johnson and Muddy Waters and Elmore James, people like that. And we'd dig out the old albums. They were pretty hard to find in Adelaide in 1965, mind you, but we'd dig them out, and the originals, of course, only had sort of like one guitar, a guy playing on a veranda somewhere, down in Mississippi. But we'd supply the rest of the band and sort of do our what you might call power pop versions of those blues classics, So, in fact, that's where we got the name from. All those guys, those blues guys, we considered them to be the masters, and of course, we thought of ourselves as being apprenticed to them in that sense. So we were the Masters Apprentices. But when we started out, that's what we were, and of course, the 60s being what they were, very turbulent times and very changeable times, obviously we had to ride with those changes, and pretty well straight away we had to change, metamorphosize, or whatever you might like to call it, into a different sort of band several times during our career.
How would you describe the music scene in Adelaide when you were there? It must have been pretty healthy, because there were some great bands that came out during that time.
Oh, look, it was. I mean, as it's written in my book, the Adelaide was sort of quite a breeding ground for a lot of bands that came out. That ended up being nationally acclaimed bands. All came from Adelaide, and I think it was mainly due to the fact that there were a lot of migrants there, a lot of English kids who'd just sort of come out from England only weeks before they'd seen, the Beatles and the Stones and the Kinks and the Who and all that, and so they were primed and ready to go. So I think it was probably the English contingent that lived in Adelaide at that time that was responsible for it.
And of course, you mentioned the blues was a major influence. Was there a deliberate or conscious effort or decision at any stage to go down a more commercial path?
It wasn't. It wasn't a conscious effort to go down a commercial path, but it was a conscious effort to start writing original material. And that original material was well, I guess you'd have to say in the early days was blues based, but it was just the way we wanted to express it, and it happened to be commercial. I mean, our first single, Undecided, was really sort of a blues based riff, and done in our own original sort of a way, and it happened to be commercial. We didn't sort of sit down and say, now let's write a song that's going to get into the top 40. That's not how it worked. It was just that, let's write songs and do them in our own way, and see what happens. And what happened was that they were commercial. So it wasn't a conscious effort to be a pop band. No.
Undecided was absolutely a sensational single to debut with. Did you remember feeling at the time that you had something pretty special there with that track, even before release?
No, I have to say no. Funnily enough, no, because the song itself was written in about 5 minutes, and it was written. We were told to go in, or we were asked to go in and record four tracks as a demo, so we had 3 that we were ready with, but we sort of didn't know what to do for a fourth song, so we'd recorded the 3, and then for the fourth song we just. Mick Bauer, who was our songwriter at the time, said, "Look, I'll just go away here into a corner here for a minute and knock out something, and we'll do a fourth song." And so he went away and came back about 5 minutes later and said, "Right, I've got a riff, and I got we got some words here," and away we went, and we sort of bunged it down in probably 10 minutes, just learnt the song quickly and then bunged it down and sent it away as a demo, and of course, the rest is history. They ended up releasing the song, and it became a national #1. So we didn't think, we've got something here. We had no idea. We just did it and sent it away, and it happened to be, the record that it was.
What was your initial impression of Melbourne when you got over here? Was there immediate acceptance of the band, or did it take a while to win us over?
No, it didn't take very long at all. We came over on a couple of reconnaissance missions, you might say. We came over for a 2-week period in like mid-66, and then went back again and learned a lot from the 2 weeks we were here. We learned that it was a different sort of a scene, and it was bigger, and there was more bands around. But we still had a feeling that we had something, that was fairly different. And then we came over again for a second time, and that we stayed a bit longer, probably 3 or 4 weeks, and really started to make inroads. Then we went on a couple of television shows that were around, The Go Show and Commotion, with the single Undecided, and then that's when it really started to sort of happen. And then we went back to Adelaide, and then we thought, right, well, we've really got to make the move permanently to Melbourne. We knew Melbourne was where we had to go. I mean, it was the hub of the entertainment industry in those, it wasn't an industry, but the rock and roll scene was based in Melbourne. So we knew we just had to get to Melbourne. So by the third time, which was late '66, we came over, and by then sort of people did know who we were, and we looked fairly different. I mean, we were into a mod thing by then, which was like mod haircuts and stuff, which in Melbourne hadn't really taken off yet. We were sort of like real cutting edge, I suppose you might call it. And when we came to Melbourne, I mean, we looked different and sounded different, and we were sort of like accepted immediately. The kids thought we were great.
Sydney was never quite as obliging, though, was it, as Melbourne? They were a tougher audience for you, weren't they?
They were later on. Early on, they weren't. Early on, they accepted us really well. Undecided was a hit there. Buried and Dead was too. Living in a Child's Dream. Elevator Driver even. But then it started to peter off after that for some reason. I don't know why. It was just a little bit of rivalry started to emerge the Sydney-Melbourne rivalry started to emerge by about 68, I suppose. So in 66, 67, when we had a few hits, we were quite well accepted in Sydney. I mean, in fact, in my book, I write about a story about the band going to Sydney one particular time and just getting treated like the Beatles, you know, when it was huge there. So early on it was great, but later on it started to wear thin. Yeah. I don't know why that was. It's just one of those things where we had all those early hits, and then we kept having hits in Melbourne, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and Adelaide, and of course Perth and Tasmania. But Sydney, for some reason, they were still hits, but they just didn't chart as well as they did elsewhere.
Right. What are your memories of those old Battle of the Bands type competitions? Were they pretty competitive amongst the bands?
They were. I mean, reason being is because basically they were the only way out of Australia. I mean, you know, in those days, no band, you just didn't get paid enough money. There was no money in rock and roll in those days, and so that you couldn't afford to sort of all fly out and go to England and then live there and you know, and compete because there was just not the money. So the only way out was to win a trip over, you know. And so Battle of the Sounds became the method of escape. And if you could win that and get away to England, you were pretty good. So it was every band really wanted to win that, and so they all went all out to win it. And of course we did too, you know.
How important was creating and maintaining an image to the band? Or was that something held probably in greater importance by management or yourselves?
No. We didn't really have much of a management. We managed ourselves. We were sort of, again, as it says in the book, we were sort of virtually unmanageable. We were one of those sort of bands that really had our own distinct way of doing things. We had our own mind on how we wanted to be and what we wanted to do, and management didn't really have much of a role in it because we knew what we wanted and knew how to get it, and away we went. So management, we did have managers along the way, but they tended to be sort of fairly insignificant in as much as guiding our career. We did that ourselves. But image was very important to us, and we were very much at the forefront of that. We were very conscious of looking great as well as sounding good. I mean, that was the era when you had to do that anyway. I mean, later on, when pub rock came in, it didn't matter if you wore an old ripped T-shirt and a pair of jeans, but earlier on you had to look the part, and we really did. I mean, we were the leaders of fashion, I guess you would have to say, in our day. I mean, you know, we used to. I remember going into. Nobody else had thought of this, but I went along to soft furnishings departments, and I'd buy a material that you made lounge suites and curtains out of, and I'd have them made into jackets and trousers and stuff like that, and really quite over the top. But the kids loved it, and we looked different, and and it worked for us.
With all that mass adulation, the teeny bopper type adulation going on around you, did it ever reach a point in time where, as musicians, you just became frustrated that it was drawing attention away from the actual music, and particularly in a live situation?
Not earlier on. I mean, earlier on we just accepted that that's how it was, and you didn't know any different. You didn't know that they could. There was no audience in those days. There was no audience that just sat there and listened to you play. So you didn't know that could be the way it was, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. They were all screamed at every gig. And for every band. So there was very little. Well, there might have been instances where they were a bit quieter and they listened, but not very often. We didn't really think about that. We just accepted it as that's how it was. And it wasn't until later on, maybe in our career, obviously just before we went to England and after we'd been to England and came back again, that was the period then in the early 70s there, where the whole pop scene changed almost overnight. Again, that's in my book. The history of it shows that almost overnight the 60s pop bands disappeared, and in came the new wave. And at the very same time, pub rock was born. So a whole new thing happened all of a sudden, almost overnight. These other bands were gone. The pop bands with the velvet jackets and the frilly shirts had all of a sudden disappeared, and pub rock came in, where they did just sit and watch and get into the band and musically. So that was another transition that we had to make, from being a band that just played pop music to kids, to one that was musically proficient enough to be able to be listened to properly and appreciated in that way.
Do you have a particular favourite concert memory?
Well, there were lots, really. You couldn't really single out one, because there was different ones along the way that was significant. I mean, I remember Maya Music Bowl. There was one there where we played to a huge crowd of 200,000, and they went absolutely ballistic and screaming and carrying on, and you just felt. That was one of those feelings. You just feel great playing it to an audience like that. And then later on, there was one in Hyde Park in Sydney, which was just fantastic, an amazing concert. But probably when you boil it down, it was probably some little hot, sweaty gig somewhere in like at the Beat Basement when we first started that really did it. I mean, you can play to 100,000 people, but sometimes you can get more satisfaction out of an audience of a couple of hundred in a little gig somewhere.
Yeah.
I couldn't really say I could single out one gig and say this was the gig, because we did thousands of gigs,
Yeah.
and for all different reasons. So there was great ones and there were shitty ones,
Was it always apparent to you that one day Glenn would go down the entrepreneurial route that he eventually did?
Oh, yeah, that was fairly obvious. I mean, I got him in the band in the first place simply because he with the band he was in before, the Bay City Union, he was a great hustler. I mean, the Bay City Union weren't a terrific band. They were a marginal sort of fringe band as it was. They were a blues purist band, and the pop scene had really sort of come in a big way, and they were really, I guess you'd have to say, not really suited to the scene. It was obvious that they weren't the type of band that was going to have huge hit records and be a big band. But despite that, Glenn used to get them lots and lots of gigs, because he's such a great hustler. He'd be up when everybody else was up at the crack of noon. He was up at the crack of dawn, out there hustling the agent. He'd get to the agent's office before the agent got there, and he'd be getting lots of gigs for this band that really probably didn't deserve to get that many gigs, because they weren't that good. So when it came to needing a bass player, I thought, not only is he a good bass player, or at least a reasonable bass player, but he's a great hustler, and we could do with somebody like that, So
Yeah.
So it was for his sort of early inklings of being a manager. It was for those reasons that I got him in the band in the first place.
Wrecking off to England when you did you have any preconceived notions what to expect when you got there? Or?
No, we had no idea. Or any ideas we may have had were quickly allayed when we actually got there, because when we got there we realised that it was totally different to how we thought. They were miles ahead in England in those days, in lots of areas, with the whole industry. See, in Australia up till then, it wasn't much of an industry. In fact, you couldn't even call it an industry. It was more like a hobby. There wasn't many real producers that could produce a band properly. There wasn't any real managers that could manage a band properly. The promoters were all a bit shonky, and it was all a bit rough and ready in Australia. But when we got to England, we realised that it was an industry with great producers, great studios, great management. The whole thing was a proper industry, run and well-oiled industry that ran very proficiently. And we realised that Australia was a long way behind.
Recording at Abbey Road must have been a great buzz. Any special memories there? Were you overawed by it all in any way?
No, not at all. That's the funny part I don't know if it's a funny part about it, but we weren't overawed at all. I mean, we got there. I mean, it was fantastic to go into Abbey Road Studios to record. I mean, that was a great thrill. But we were a recording band. We'd been on the road for a long time. We'd played thousands of gigs. We'd done a lot of recording. So it's not as if it was all new to us. I mean, you know, the level of proficiency there was all new to us. I mean, it was really well run and with great producers, and the whole thing was up a few notches by Australian standards, no doubt about that. But we weren't overawed by it. I mean, we were a recording band after all, and we just walked in there and thought, right, okay, we're gonna really go for it here. Our confidence was high. We knew we had some good material, and you know, we went straight in there with that. We weren't daunted by it at all, no. And that's despite the fact that John Lennon was in the studio across the corridor. You know, he was there, but you know, we thought we weren't even overawed by him being there, really. I mean, you know, we just thought, well, he's there recording his album, we're recording our album. We've sort of thought of ourselves as just as valid as him in lots of ways, you know.
Yeah. If you had that whole England experience over again, would there be any one thing that you'd probably do a little bit differently?
Oh yes, definitely, and that would be to sign with the record company that made us an offer. We got offered a deal when we were in England, and we didn't have any support from Australia at all. We were contracted to EMI in Australia, even though we were in England, and EMI Australia had no idea what it took to break a band internationally in those days. They just didn't have a clue, and so they ended up sending us $500 as an advance, which, I mean, you wouldn't buy 2 JBL speakers, you know what I mean? So we were supposed to make it in the world, you know, on $500. I mean, it's just ludicrous to even think about it. But we were offered a big advance to sign with a label in London, and we didn't because we were naive, really. We thought, oh, hang on, we can't sign with another record company. We were already signed to a record company. We'll end up in jail. But that's not the case. A lot of bands actually did get offers from record companies, and they'd sign the new deal and let the lawyers work out, you know, all the other stuff in between. And we should have, when we got our offer, we should have signed with them, and you know, we probably would have made it in a big way, because the other two, that was a small label that was starting up called Bronze Records, and they had Slade and Uriah Heep were their other 2 bands, and they wanted us as a 3rd band. And you know, those 2 bands ended up having a lot of hits and you know, and being very big, and I'm sure we could have done that too.
What about America? Was that ever looked at as an option at any stage?
No, not in those days. I mean, it wasn't until much later on. It was probably not until, you know, probably the late 70s, which was a good decade later, before America opened up to Australians. I mean, in the 60s, it was just never thought of to go to America. There was no contact with anybody in America at all. There were no record company sort of infrastructure. There was nothing where you would be attracted to go to America, because it was, you know, at least EMI was an English company, and not only that, but you know, it was all British music in those days. You know, the British post Beatles was all the British invasion, you know, and American bands, the American thing wasn't all that attractive then. There was very little coming out of America, to be quite honest. There was any real, you know, it was much chop, to be quite honest. I mean, Australia and the Australian bands were more focused on that English sort of style of things in those days than they were the American style.
Is there a particular moment in time when you started to see the writing on the wall for the end of the band?
Yeah, I suppose there was. It was when we were there for the second. We went back to England a second time to do the second album at Abbey Road, and I realised that because we still had no money, and you know, money was running out, and it was obvious that we just didn't have we didn't have the equipment necessary to go and compete with the bands of the time over in England. We didn't have the money to do anything really, to even buy a van to get the equipment around in. even if we had the equipment. I mean, we were right down there in the rock bottom. Even though we weren't musically, we were as good. I mean, we went out and used to watch other bands in London, and a lot of them were awe-inspiring, of course, but a lot of them we'd think, gee, they're a pretty big band, but we're easily as good as them, if not better. We really thought we could compete, but we just didn't have the resources. We didn't have the machinery around us that it takes to break it internationally. We didn't have, and so the first time I was optimistic, but by the second time I realised, the writing's on the wall here. It's just not going to happen right now. So I just knew that was the end. And when Glenn left first, and he got offered a job in an agency because we just had no money, and he accepted the job, and I thought, I realised then there was just no use going on. I knew it was the end of the band then.
After the band broke up, you didn't jump immediately into the solo thing. You did a few other things first. Did you feel a need to take a break?
Yeah, I did. I'd been in the band. I was the only member that was in there from day one. I was there. The band was named Masters Apprentices, and I was there the very last day. And all the rest had sort of, Glenn, Colin, and Doug had only been in there, sort of half the band's career, and I'd been in there the whole way, and so and in those days, of course, you didn't come off the road to write songs for the album or anything like that. It was nothing like that. You worked 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks of the year. You did gigs. I mean, that's how it worked back then. So I'd just been driven into the ground by then. I mean, it was just a huge workload that sent many of the other members, off. They had nervous breakdowns and ulcers and all sorts of things. The original lineup only lasted, a matter of, some of them, only months, because it was just such a rugged lifestyle in general, and workload. I don't even know how I survived it all. I mean, it was just an amazing thing. So I'd been there for all those years, and I was pretty tired from it all. And I thought I left London and went back to Adelaide, where it all started. And I thought for a while there I was going to just buy a house and happily ever after, but no, that wasn't the case. I soon got itchy feet and wanted to do it again, but I did a few things in between. I like to be a bit of a jack of all trades, and I did some journalism. I wrote for Go Set magazine. I was a promoter. I ran some dances and gigs over there in Adelaide and for a while, but I soon got bored with that, and then luckily I got a call from Melbourne wanting me to star in, or be one of the stars in the rock opera Tommy, which was great. So that sort of got me back into the swing of things again, and off I went from there.
Now, I believe Boy from the Stars is about to find re-release on CD, which is fantastic news. Yeah,
no, it is good. It's the 25th anniversary version that's coming out on CD for the very first time. Look, I mean, it was one of those. It was strange because it's one of those albums that seems to have, I guess, gained more momentum as the years went by. It's become a bit of a sort of a collector's item, a bit of a sort of getting to be a bit of a cult following, if you know what I mean. And it seems to have gained more importance as the years have gone on than it was actually at the time.
It's a fantastic record. It still holds up well today.
You think it does?
It does, yeah. I believe it does.
Yeah. I was always very disappointed with the production because when I recorded it in 74, late 74, it was just before the electronic boom that came in, probably only 6 months later, the whole Moog thing started and electronic music sort of, all these keyboard instruments started emerging. And that album had scope to have that, being a concept album and being a sort of with a space sort of theme, really needed that sort of sound, and I I had these sounds in my head that sort of hadn't been invented yet, and I tried to sort of get them onto the record somehow by using strange and weird sort of contraptions to try and get the sounds that if I'd waited 6 months or a year, I could have easily got when all this electronic stuff came in. So, in retrospect, looking back, I thought, gee, if only I'd waited another six to 12 months, I would have got the record I wanted. But
I think you got a great result anyway.
Oh well, yeah. Look, I mean, it was a concept that was a little bit sort of before its time, really. I mean, the Bowie thing that came a bit later, the Man Who Fell to Earth or whatever it was later on after that, and a few people have, there was a whole lot of concept albums after that, but that was probably around about the first one.
You had a special live show that supported it that I think only got a couple of airings. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, it was so. I mean, the live versions of it were so enormous in those days, and who I'd used on the record. I mean, I used the who's who of Australian music on that album, and to reproduce that live on stage, you'd have to have all those people. I mean, it was just too hard. And I ended up doing it at Sunbury, and it was a huge success there. I mean, people that have seen that saw that show still come up to me today and say, "Oh, it was just magnificent, magic show." Because look, I had a spaceship that came down from the ceiling up in the rafters there, and a 14-piece band, and incredible costume changes and set design and set changes and all these sort of things before anybody had done it, and it was a real theatrical sort of event, and very, very hard to do, especially when I really had no outside help with it. I mean, I didn't have record company or management or any of that support. I had to sort of do it all on my own, so it made it pretty difficult. But despite those constraints, I mean, it's amazing how well it turned out.
How do you look back on the Masters reunion in the 80s?
Very fondly. The thing was that while I was conceiving it, I started to doubt whether I wanted to do it, because being a music fan myself, I know that some of these reunions, I mean, people that I really admired, and then go and see them live when they do their reunion, you sort of can get let down because it shatters the myth, if you know what I mean. A myth builds up about somebody or an act, and you go and see them, and after all, they're only mere mortals all of a sudden, and you go, oh, hang on, they're not as good as I remembered them, because you tend to remember things as bigger and better than they really were, and that was the case with the Masters. I mean, a lot of people sort of used to say to me, "Oh, the Masters were just fantastic," they were just, and they weren't really. I mean, no, they were okay, but they were just a normal band, And so I thought, oh, hang on, will it shatter the myth if we do this again, But what spurred me on to actually go through with it was the fact that Doug and Colin and myself had all kept playing all those years. We weren't rusty, We a lot of those reunions. I remember seeing the Loved Ones. I think it was just before the Loved Ones actually did a reunion just before us.
That's right, yeah.
And I remember seeing them and thinking, oh my God, this is embarrassing, because they looked like bank tellers, a couple of them, and they and they were really rough. They hadn't played guitar for 25 years, and they got it out of the cupboard and blown the dust off it, and away they went. And it just didn't do anything for me. And I loved the Loved Ones. The Loved Ones, they're still one of my favourite bands of all time. And that was disappointing to see them like that. But what spurred me on, as I said, was the fact that we weren't rusty, and we had all been playing, and we still all looked pretty good, and so. And I was proved right. In the end, we had it was an enormous success. We had to end up doing 3 tours because the first one was just such a great success that all the promoters and the agents and stuff were saying, look, you got to go out again. So went out again, and then we went out a third time, and we also had a top 10 hit again with the remake of Because I Love You. So all in all, I'd have to say it was fantastic. A lot of fun, a great success, and the main thing. Above all, was the fact that we perpetuated the band's name to a whole new audience of kids that had never seen or heard the band before.
Sure.
which was great because before the tour, people were saying, "Who do you think's going to turn up? What percentage?" And I said, "Well, I think it'll probably be about 70% old fans from back in the 60s who want to see the band again, and maybe 30%, younger people who are curious about it, And I was totally wrong. It was about 90% of young people who were curious and about 10% of the old fans who stood up the back. And those young kids, it was amazing. We'd be performing on stage there, and I'd look down and they'd all be singing the words along with me as I was singing them, and I thought they weren't even born then, So that was fantastic to see young kids, that wanted to come along to see what it was all about, and it was great that we could play to those kids and that they could accept us.
If you could pinpoint it down to one particular thing, what do you think it is most about the Masters that has allowed it to maintain such a high profile, even now 3 decades since its heyday?
The longevity of the band, the ability to roll with the changes, and we were the only band that went from 65 to 72. We were the only band in Australia that actually survived all those eras. There were so many eras then. We started off as an R&B rhythm and blues band, then we went to a psychedelic band, then we went to a sort of rock band, and then a pop rock band, and then a progressive rock band, and made it into each era. Whereas other bands sort of seem to come and go in the one era, our strength is in the fact that we changed our music, we changed our appearance, we changed our persona along with the changes, with the rapid changes that were happening in music at the time. And the other thing was that we were a step ahead too. We didn't change after it had all come in after the fact and go, oh, hang on, psychedelic music's here now, let's go psychedelic. We sort of went psychedelic before psychedelic music came in, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Living in a Child's Dream actually preempted the whole psychedelic thing in Australia.
What would be the worst career decision you've ever made, do you think?
Sacking our original manager, and that's in my book. A guy called Graham Longley, who was there the day I arrived. He was already there, and he was one of those guys that grew up with the band, loved the band. He wasn't a musician himself, but he was sort of. A lot of managers came up that way. I remember reading a story about Led Zeppelin's manager, for example, and lots of others along the way that were just sort of fans that just wanted to be there and wanted to do it and happy to lug the equipment in and organise things for the guys, that sort of thing. And that's what Graham was like. He was fantastic. He knew us back to front. He organised our first gigs and all our gigs along the way. He looked out for us all the time. He was with us day and night. He was one of us, even though he didn't get up on stage. And what happened was when we left Adelaide and went to Melbourne, I was advised, probably wrongly, that we needed a manager that was that knew all the right people and that could get us to the top. And this guy wasn't. He was just a hick from Adelaide and he couldn't do it. And I thought it made sense. I thought, oh yeah, we probably do need somebody that knows all the right people. And so I elected to vote him out. And in retrospect now, I really wish that he'd stayed with us because we needed somebody like that.
Yeah. Okay.
But, who knows what could have happened. I mean, he might have stayed with us and then we disintegrated. You can't predict these things. What happened, and that's the way it was. But, that's probably my only regret.
Yeah.
And my other regret was probably not seeing the door deal thing, that came later on. Because we were pulling 7,000 kids in Brisbane Festival Hall and getting $10 each for it, if only we'd seen door deals coming, we could have made a few bob out of it.
Too late to change it now, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. No, I actually wouldn't change anything. I'd do it all over again. Actually, that was a great time to be involved in music. It was a great thrill to be there. It was an exciting period, the halcyon days really of rock and roll, and it was just great to be a part of it. And to go into the Hall of Fame is another thing that, such a great honour, and to go in there and as a culmination to our whole career, it's just magnificent.
And just before I let you go, Jim, what's in the books for the next year or so, in the year 2000? Any live work on recording?
Heaps of stuff, yeah. Well, they want me to do another book because the first one's done so well that they've asked me if is there another one in me, and there probably is if I wanted to continue on the story because the first book leaves off when the Masters split up, but then after that, of course, there was, like we just spoke about, there was the Tommy, there was the Sunbury, there was a Boy from the Stars, all that stuff happened, and there's probably a book in that too, so I'll probably do another book. I've just finished a documentary, a long form video documentary of the band, which I just sold to the ABC, and that's coming out in February. That's going to be aired, and it's also going to be able to be bought in the ABC shops as well. So that's coming out. It's called Turn Up Your Video. And that comes out in February on television. So that was quite a big undertaking that I've just sort of completed in the last month or two. I've got some radio stuff that I want to do. I've been looking at doing a radio show, actually, which interests me a lot. Radio's interested me for quite some time, and I have done some radio, and I'd like to do some radio stuff, which I'll probably do, as well as live gigs. I love playing live, and I still work regularly, and I've got a band that I can call on any time, and we go and do gigs. I did one last week, so I like doing that. I've also written enough material for another album, which I'd like to record in the new year as well. So there's heaps of stuff. I've written a musical. That's another one that I've written a musical over the last sort of period of a year or 18 months. I've actually written a musical that I'd like to see it end up getting staged somewhere or at some stage. So there's heaps going on.
Oh, that's fantastic. So plenty to keep you busy.
Yeah.
That's great. Listen, Jim, thanks again for your time. I really do appreciate it.
Oh, look, it's an absolute pleasure, and any time, maybe in the new millennium, I'll come on and have a yak about something else.
Oh, that'd be fantastic. I know you're probably all interviewed out at the moment. You've been doing the book tour for the last month or so.
I have, yeah. It's been a pretty busy couple of months, but it's reflected in the sales. The sales have been very strong for the book, so I can't complain.
I'm sure it's going to find its way into 1 million Christmas stockings over the next.
Well, it's in all the apparently it's in all the Christmas catalogues for like Dymocks and Angus and Robertson and Collins Booksellers and all those people. They're all got them in their catalogues. So I suppose that'd spur a few sales along.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks again,
John.
Jim. I do appreciate it, and thanks for waiting up for me at this ungodly hour.
That's all right. Not a problem.
All the best.
Okay. You too.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.